My name is, I'm the commissioner representing employers at the Texas Workforce Commission. And so on behalf of the 565,000 Texas employers and 2.6 million small businesses, I'd like to welcome all of you to our final Lunchtime Live employment law session of the year. You know, there have been over 6,000 registrants that have joined the 6 sessions, and we appreciate your attendance, especially if you are a returning employer. You know, this year, Texas employers have dealt with many issues that we've never faced before. And I hope these sessions have helped you navigate those uncharted waters. I'd like to take this time to recognize our 4 employment law attorneys on our team: Tommy Simmons, Elsa Ramos, Belisa Chapa, and Mario Hernandez, who have presented on well over 60 virtual town hall meetings and have answered countless emails and phone calls during these unprecedented times. My hat is tipped to each one of them, and I say thank you for all that you do. Well, today, as we wind down, you are in for a special treat. We have Katrina Grider as our guest speaker, and she is one of the most top requested speakers here in Texas, and I go and say in the nation. You're going to also have an opportunity to hear from our rock star employment law attorneys as well, as they cover a variety of topics in the hour ahead. And so let's get started with a few housekeeping items before we go on. If you experience any technical difficulties during this session, don't stress out. We'll be recording this session and have it available on our website for you to view and to share. CLE credit will not be available for these virtual sessions, but once we start back in-person conferences, those credits will be offered as usual. And finally, I want you to sit back, relax, and enjoy these presentations. Our office is here for you and will continue to be an essential resource for you as we move forward. Thank you for your participation today, and let's continue to make progress. And so now let me turn it over to Tommy Simmons.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today's webinar, Katrina Grider, who is the Associate Director of Curriculum, Training, and Education at the EEOC's National Office. Before joining the EEOC, Ms. Grider was in private practice as one of the preeminent management side employment law attorneys in our state. She is board certified in Texas as a specialist in labor and employment law. She has spoken at well over 1,000 employment law conferences. It could easily be 2,000, including dozens of the Texas Conference for Employers conferences sponsored by the Employer Commissioner's Office. She is talking today about COVID-19 impacting women for years. Welcome, Ms. Grider.
Thank you all very much, Commissioner. It's an honor to be presenting at your programs. All of the attorneys, Felisa, Tommy, Mario, Elsa, I enjoy working with you all, and I hope that there'll be a time when we can all come back again live. So what we're going to talk about today is COVID-19 and the impact on women. It is a tremendous impact that we're going to talk about today that will have long-term impact on women. One of the things we're going to do is talk about how the McKinsey report, oops, hang on a second, my clicker just stopped working. Talking about how women are vulnerable in a pandemic because of the economic effects of gender inequalities. One of the things that you're going to see, and one of the things that we are seeing in some of the statistics, is that women in many of the lower paying jobs, housekeeping, the restaurant industry, other kinds of jobs, have not been able to go back to those jobs even now when businesses have reopened and people are starting to go back. Many of those jobs will never open again. And for women in those populations, they're vulnerable economically. Here's some alarming numbers. And when I took a look at this initially, I was shocked. This is a chart from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is the monthly job report for September 2020. Look at this for a moment. 1.1 million workers over the age of 20 have dropped out of the labor force. And what that means is they are no longer working or they're no longer looking for work. But what is particularly alarming about this, 80% of those workers are women, 865,000 women. And of that, 324,000 are Latina women, 58,000 are Black women. One of the things we're going to talk about in this session is why that is and what is going to happen at companies across America in all kinds of sizes if women cannot come back in the workplace. There is a world report, because this has been also measured in the global economy, and the World Bank has estimated, first when they were looking at gender inequality and gender compensation, that it would take almost 257 years for women around the world to have gender parity with regard to pay. What they've predicted now is, with this pandemic going on, it will set back women a generation, an entire generation, because of this. So one of the other things that we see about this are alarming numbers in women's unemployment rates. Now, one of the things that you'll see here, and you'll look at it, Black women are 11.1%, Latina women 11%, women in the age groups of 20 to 24, many of whom have not been able to return to college and may not be able to after this pandemic. And then you see women with disabilities at the highest unemployment rate. But yet you see men holding pretty much steady at 7.4%. Now, one of the things out there, and one of the studies that has talked about this, is the way this pandemic has affected women. When we had the recessions going on back in 2009, men were unemployed. But what they had was they had a cushion because women were at home working and they could still maintain the household. Or in some instances, the woman could go out and work and support the family. This situation is completely different. I think I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal that actually labeled this a she session as opposed to a man session going back to 2009. In part because when women cannot come back into the workplace, the impact is greater. It's not like that they have somebody who's a backup or support system. So when you have households like that where women have been adversely impacted because they can't come back into the job market because of things like childcare responsibilities or things like working in an industry where they may be vulnerable populations. Still, we have, as I mentioned before, gender inequality as far as compensation. And as you see this, you still see these things going on in the workplace. One of the things I'd like to remind everyone, and people will be focusing on this, and the EEOC will be focusing on this, is the anniversary. It'll be the 60th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act in 2023. And one of the things that the Commission is always looking for and looking at are things of gender discrimination and gender pay issues. Now, the McKinsey report. This particular report was published by McKinsey and Company and Lean In Organization. The report was first published in 2015. It's been updated from 2015 to 2019, and it is probably one of the largest independent resources for studying women in the workplace. This study encompasses 600 companies across the country. They have interviewed over 250,000 people in the workplace about the status of women. So it's someplace that you can go to if you want to read. It's a very detailed report. There are case studies in it. But for purposes of what we're talking about today, I wanted to talk about some of the findings. This report was just issued in August. And one of the things that they focused on are the effects of women in the workplace, particularly women in general, working mothers, women of color, women with disabilities, LGBTQ+ women, and women in senior levels of positions in organizations. Now, take a look at this. 2 million women are considering taking a leave of absence or leaving the workforce altogether. Now, in 2015, women and men left companies at the similar rates. In 2020, due to the pandemic, women are leaving at the workforce at higher rates than men. This is going to have a long-term impact. One, it will have fewer women in leadership positions, and it will have fewer women in the pipeline for those positions. And this is where the efforts and the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion come to play. Maintaining women in the applicant pools, maintaining women in the pools as they move up through organizations, and reaching out and keeping them in the workforce, is going to be a key criteria. Let's talk about why women are leaving. Why are women leaving? Lack of flexibility in work. Now, people think, well, you know, Kat, we have people in these remote working environments. Why is that an issue? Many of you have probably experienced this. You've got Zoom fatigue, you've got MS Teams fatigue, but imagine a situation where you are trying to remote learn or do remote learning with your kids. Some schools have had hybrid situations, and basically, you know, you're in a situation where you're on almost 24 hours. That's a lot. And you'll see a lot of reports right now about burnout and stress being one of the #1 reasons why women are leaving. Housework and caregiving burdens due to COVID-19. We'll take a look in a moment, but women have a disproportionate share of household responsibilities in childcare. That's unpaid work, and it's unpaid hours. They worry that their performance is going to be negatively judged because of their caregiving responsibilities. One of the things that I think someone shared a story with me about 2 or 3 months ago, she was on a Zoom call with some of her managers, and one of her little toddlers was running behind her during the Zoom call, and she was just trying to tell the little boy, hey, after she got off the call, she got an email from somebody else on her team, and they said, well, you know, you need to make sure that your kids are locked up when you get on Zoom calls. Wow. So it's interesting that people are saying things like that. And when people feel stressed about trying to find that space in their living room or finding that space on a bedroom, you know, where they have a blank wall or they have some lamps so they can have some semblance of having a professional Zoom conference or an MS Teams conference, can be kind of frustrating. Many women are leaving because they feel blindsided by decisions that affect their day-to-day work. Now, one of the things that I've seen, and actually before I joined the commission, I saw this happening a lot when employers were making decisions about COVID-19, whether it was return to work issues, or whether it was furlough or layoff decisions, or restructuring jobs. And many times there was a lack of communication with their workforces as to why these things were going on. So when you're in a position, particularly perhaps if you're a single parent or you're a single working mom, and you face the uncertainty of whether or not you're still going to be on the payroll, you know, that's an important thing that companies need to be paying attention to about being transparent in their communications. Many women don't feel like they can bring their whole authentic selves to work. And again, there's an aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this kind of context. Now, you'll hear a lot of people talk about diversity and inclusion, and you won't hear the equity part in it. But the way I think I've often thought about this is, and this is the concept I've used, you know, when you think of a party and you're thinking about planning a party, I think of diversity as being invited to the party. Equity is being on the planning committee for the party. And inclusion is being able to choose the music for the party. And all of those concepts come together. So what you have here and what the McKinsey report was talking about, women feel like they cannot bring their authentic selves to work. They can't feel like they can talk about the pressures and the stress of what it's like to be doing remote work, homeschooling with their children, carrying a full-time job, and actually maybe even caring for someone who may be having COVID-19. So sharing those challenges without feeling like they're being judged, or sharing those challenges without feeling like that's going to have a negative long-term impact on their career, is an issue that was very much discussed in the McKinsey report. Why are some women leaving? Let's go through this. This is where you have caregiving responsibilities and motherhood that come to play. The McKinsey report spent a great deal of time talking about mothers being worried that their performance is going to be negatively judged because of their caregiving responsibilities. And the example that I just used a moment ago of the manager who was criticized by her own management team because her little boy was running around on a Zoom call is an example of that. Many times I've observed that those kinds of statements are not said to a man. Black women are more likely than women to feel like they cannot bring their whole selves to work. And that was true even before COVID-19. But it's particularly true when you see the impact on Black women, when you're talking about all of the current events that have happened this summer with Black Lives Matter and other things. The other issue that people don't talk about is the rise in domestic violence during this pandemic. And that has disproportionately affected Black women, actually more than Latina women. So having to balance all of those things is difficult. If you're a woman in a senior leadership position, it's hard because the standards are higher because you're in a higher level of management. And again, always having to be on, always having to make sure that, you know, everything you've got it going on the ball, and presenting that face is difficult. Now, please don't take away from this that I'm saying that it's just easy for a man. That is not what I'm saying at all. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is, in a time when it's difficult for all of us in the workplace, women are having just a tougher time. We're all having a tougher time, but women are having just a little bit more tougher time. Here is another dynamic that is impacting particularly women of color. Many of them are not being able to return to the workplace because they are caring for someone in their family who is at risk, a high-risk category under COVID-19, or someone in their family is suffering from COVID. When you look at the rates of cases and hospitalization and death rates, Black and Hispanic and Latino populations are suffering at rates of almost 3 times higher than the rest of the population. Hospitalization rates, rates of death. And this has a profound impact, particularly on Black and Latino women who may be the only caregiver in the household. So that is an added pressure on top of all of these other economic and financial situations. Women of color are shouldering a burden that's just, it's harder. It's harder for them. Why? They are more likely to be the family's sole breadwinner and to have partners working outside the home. So everybody is depending on her. And think about this for a moment. If she is the sole breadwinner and she loses her job, with that goes health insurance. And when you don't have health insurance, the thought of having to deal with a COVID-19 situation is daunting. The other thing that has happened, and you see this when you see the long lines of people at food banks, when you have someone of color that is a sole breadwinner who is out of a job, people's financial means simply go to priorities like food, and people have food insecurity. So this has a domino effect throughout the population. Latina mothers are 1.6 times more likely than white mothers to be responsible for all childcare and housework, and Black mothers are twice as likely to be handling all of this for their families. So it's a lot. It's a lot. Women of color, both Black women and Latina women, are more likely to have been laid off and furloughed during this COVID-19 crisis. This has a profound impact on stalling their careers. I read an article that appeared, I think, yesterday in the Harvard Business Review, and it was talking about how just being out of work, if you are a woman, just for the time period of anywhere from a year to 2 years, has a profound impact on your financial stability long-term in your career. So you can imagine what's happening when women who have been unemployed as a result of this pandemic, and given what the current conditions are in the country, may not be able to come back to a job even after vaccines are available. Compared with women overall, Latina women are more likely to worry about layoffs and furloughs. And that's not surprising when you look at where their jobs are. You know, many hotels, restaurants, cleaning services, all of those kinds of lower paying jobs reflect that. LGBTQ women are twice as likely as employees to cite mental health as one of their biggest challenges during COVID-19. So what you have going on here is a perfect storm. And what companies need to be recognizing, how do we address these issues? How do we retain talent? And how do we attract talent for women who have been out of the workforce? So, you know, one of the things we'll talk about in a little bit is, you know, what about things like doing retraining, or, you know, offering job fairs to women to get them back in the workplace, and maybe providing them with mentors and things like that if they're changing careers. So there's a whole lot of different things that companies can be doing to try to retain the women that they have, but to attract women back into the workforce. COVID-19, they're more than twice as likely to say that the death of a loved one has been one of their biggest challenges during this time period. Incidents of racial violence, you know, have had an impact on people. And you had the perfect storm of Black Lives Matter and a pandemic coming to force here. And many Black women at work feel like they're not supported. It's like people don't care about what I'm feeling, or people don't care and have not asked me how I'm doing. So again, that kind of goes back to, you know, a best practice of companies having an overall strategy of providing environments with empathy and cultural empathy. They are also less likely to report that managers have asked about their workloads and their situations. Many Black women have reported in the McKinsey report that they don't have allies in the workplace. So you have DE&I overlays on top of a pandemic, and you can see the long-term impacts that can have on women of color. Here's the other thing. When we talk about being able to bring your authentic self to work, it's difficult, and it's been difficult for Black women and Black men actually throughout this pandemic to talk about these feelings and to talk about these current events that affect their lives. And it's difficult, it's very difficult to separate those two things when you come to work. So having difficult conversations, having avenues where employees, you know, all employees, not just employees of color, but we all can come together and support each other and have conversations that provide not only emotional support, but looking long-term and providing financial support by, if we can, keeping people on the payroll. Women with disabilities. You saw the statistic that I mentioned a moment ago. This is huge. Women with disabilities already struggle very hard. They are less likely to report getting the flexibility that they need at work during a pandemic. What this brings up is accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, the EEOC has published on its website, www.eeoc.gov, Q&As about COVID-19, the ADA, and the Rehabilitation Act. And there's a section in those Q&As that deal with reasonable accommodation. And it talks about reasonable accommodations of employees with disabilities before the pandemic and what employers need to consider how they accommodate those disabilities during the pandemic. So people think that it's like a no-brainer. It's like, well, you know, we don't have to provide an accommodation with someone with a disability. They're already working at home. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Do they have accessible? Do they have an accessible laptop? If somebody has a visual impairment, do they have the software at home so that they can be able to read text or Word documents and those kinds of things. They may have had it in the office, but do they have it in a remote environment? Again, the feeling of exclusion and being left out is a profound impact on women with disabilities. They are more likely than other groups to feel exhausted. And think about this, if you already are a woman and you already felt uncomfortable and felt, I don't know for the lack of a better word, you just feel like you can't come forward and tell people your struggles because of perceptions that people already have about individuals with disabilities. So one of these things I think is a best practice is reaching out to these groups, reaching out to our employees with disabilities, reaching out to women of color, finding out what's going on, what do they need. We'll talk about performance goals and how performance can be measured and how it overlays this in just a second. The other thing I want to make sure that people fully understand is I don't want people to walk away saying that I'm making broad strokes about all women. No one experience of women is this broad category, okay? Women are impacted individually as their individual circumstances. So they are not all having identical experiences. And that's important for employers to consider because here's an example. When you think about reasonable accommodation, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to that. Think of that kind of concept in the same way when we're talking about these issues. You may have several women on your payroll, some of whom are in senior management, who are being impacted by this differently than others. So part of the best practice is understanding that, being flexible in our conversations about everything, our performance standards, our communication practices, how we manage remote work environments, all of those things are important. Now, here's the big one, and this affects all women. The perception versus reality with regard to how women and childcare responsibilities are. Now, one of the things that the McKinsey report talks about, and you look at this interesting statistic, mothers report, 76% of the mothers report children under 10 as one of their top 3 challenges, as opposed to 50% of fathers who say that. Then you have 44% of working mothers think that they are splitting household labor equally with their partner, as opposed to fathers who 70% of them think that they are splitting the household work equally. So we already have notions and norms, if you will, about the roles that women have, you know, in the workplace and their roles outside of the workplace and their families. COVID-19, childcare and housework. This has a big part and a very good discussion. It's about 3 or 4 pages discussion in the McKinsey report about this. And it's I think the best way I can characterize it is when we say women are working full time and have the disproportionate share of childcare responsibilities, one of the things that they characterize that as unpaid work. And it is. Quite frankly, I think that women who are doing all of this actually are CEOs, because you have to be CEO to do what a lot of women have been doing in this pandemic. But when you take the value of that time, of that double shift, and then you think about it, well, what about women working a double shift and part of their regular shift is trying to find a job? I mean, it has an overlay on that that's just particularly troubling. Taking a heavier load, 3 times more likely as fathers to be responsible for most of the housework and caregiving, and 1.5 times more likely than fathers to be spending an extra 3 or 4 more hours a day. Okay, so when you add this up, it's equivalent to 20 hours a week or half of a full-time job for which they are not receiving compensation. It gets even more troubling and more problematic for single parents and single women. they're more likely to do all of the housework and more likely to say that financial insecurity is one of their top concerns during a pandemic. This is one of the drivers as to why women are leaving the workplace. So they're leaving, or in order to retain a job, they may have had a job at one level, but in order to stay on the payroll, they will take a reduced job or take reduced hours or take reduced pay because they have responsibilities as a single parent. In this pandemic, mothers are significantly more likely than fathers to be thinking about taking these steps. And so you have a dynamic part of the workforce and the talent pool that working mothers and single mothers bring to the workforce, and now we're seeing that potentially wiped out. So then we have perceptions about working mothers and these assumptions about, well, if you are a working mother, is there a perception or assumption that you're less committed than women without children? When women do take advantages of flexible work options, again, how is that perceived? Does that have impacts on their careers? So now that all of these things are front and center, I think as a best practice, companies are going to have to be more flexible about how women are perceived in these remote work environments. You know, maybe when you're trying to schedule, for example, a Teams call, maybe think about scheduling the Teams call maybe mid-morning because you've got a parent that's trying to do remote learning with their kids, you know, from 8 to 10 or what have you. Maybe you start the meeting at 10:30. So I think it calls for very creative solutions and approaches for employers to take to think about this. They're clearly concerned about how this kinds of perceptions and assumptions can affect their career. And one of the things that is something we need to be mindful of is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination, harassment, and retaliation on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, sexual preference, sexual identity. And when you are talking about this time and this place, being alert for how some management decisions could be considered and could be potentially discriminatory conduct when how work assignments are being doled out, how merit increases are being considered in a remote work environment. We also need to think about people who have caregiving responsibilities that are not parents. You know, sometimes people have perceptions about that, and it's, you know, it's almost kind of like a double standard. It's like, well, you don't have kids, so you ought to be able to, you know, be available 24 hours on a Zoom call. Well, maybe that person has an elderly parent, or maybe they're caring for someone with special needs. It doesn't mean and we don't value that person and their contributions in the workplace any less. Let's now talk about senior level women at senior leadership positions. Women in the executive management positions, women in the C-suite. They have and they face the same pressure to perform as men, but they're oftentimes more held to a higher standard of performance than men. When the stakes are high like they are now, they may face harsher criticism and harsher judgment. So again, those are issues that when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we look at our practices for how women are mentored in the workplace, how women are given feedback about their performance, and making sure that they get the same feedback that men are given, and given the same kinds of opportunities for advancement and promotion as men are, even in a pandemic. Senior level women are most likely to be the onlys. This is something that the McKinsey report talked about. They may be the only woman on in the C-suite. They may be the only woman on the executive management team. And then when you think about that pressure and then overlay a pandemic on that, they are 1.5 times more likely than a senior level man in a position to think about downshifting their careers. Women at the senior level still have the same child caring responsibilities and household maintenance responsibilities that women in other levels and other positions in the company. So it really is an impact on how women move through their lives and how women move through their careers in the workplace. About 3 in 4 women cite burnout as a main reason. You also see that as a factor with other levels of the organization. Now, here's the thing. Research shows, and the McKinsey report talks about this in great detail, that when women are well represented at the top, companies are 50% more likely to outperform their peers. So senior level women can have a vast and meaningful impact on the company's culture. They are more likely to embrace employer-friendly policies, family-friendly policies, and to participate in making sure that the workplace is diverse and inclusive. So having these leaders and having these women that are there to mentor other women and women of color is very important. Women are more likely to sponsor other women. This is another thing that was cited in the McKinsey report. And one of the things that they talk about in great detail is what happens when you have women at the senior level positions leave. That's a vast resource of historical knowledge, institutional knowledge, that is going to leave a void there for other women trying to move up and through the organization. Now, here are some of the economic opportunities. Think about this. Even though we've talked about businesses closing, and we've talked about a lot of industries where you have blue collar workers that are out of work, there is a little bit of bright hope here. This remote work environment has created opportunities for women to have businesses, women to have businesses online and to do other things. Now, the other part of this is, and it's kind of like that double-edged sword. On the one hand, we have the impact of what this is going to be like economically. Women who drop out of the workforce are going to miss out on promotions, particularly if companies don't, go back and give, people credit for, time served and all these other kinds of things. And as I mentioned earlier, it has an impact on women being able to provide for their families. But as I said, even with all the negative things that you see on this slide, there are still little slivers of light and opportunities for women to try to survive in this environment. So where are we? We're at a corporate crossroads. What do companies need to be doing? What should they be doing? What should they be thinking about? What are some best practices? One, let's make work more sustainable. One of the things that is going to be very, very important is this. A lot of companies right now are doing year-end performance evaluations. And let's think about, what are we evaluating? So what my point here is this. The standards that you might have had and the measures that you had before COVID-19 may not be the same measures, and for most companies they're not, for what's happened in the pandemic. So when we're talking about performance and measuring that and evaluating that, think about that. Maybe the performance goals, let's say you had a sales quota and perhaps, I don't know, maybe this person had to meet a 15% sales quota. Because there's no more sales, you may have reassigned them to another job function. Well, does that mean you're going to evaluate them from a performance standard on the sales quota? Maybe no. What about evaluating them on their performance in the job that they're currently handling because of the pandemic? So resetting goals, re-examining this, having discussions and transparent discussions about performance and expectations is critical. A lot of companies have been creative about helping employees deal with their stress. So, people giving time off for parents to prepare, in this case, prepare for the school year, but actually it's going to be now preparing for the second semester and kind of looking and seeing what that's going to look like when vaccines are going to be available. So companies can be creative about that and help people deal with their stress. And when we help people deal with their stress, we're more likely to create environments where we can do things like have best practices, follow our practices and procedures, and make sure that we're doing these kinds of things. Performance reviews. One of the things that I think is very important right now is if companies have not already done this, maybe now is the time to sit down and look at what is this person actually doing. You know, of all things that companies can be doing in this environment, one of the things that they can be doing is reviewing their employee handbook. I mean, right there in that. I mean, looking at their employee handbook, looking at their leave policies, looking at their ADA policies, looking at their FMLA policies, and seeing what they need to do. Looking at their pay policies and practices. Do we need to be doing a compensation audit right now and looking for gender inequalities or race or national origin inequalities? So all of these things are important, and where you want to be at the end of the day is making sure that the expectations of the company or that manager match what the employee believes that they should be doing, particularly being modified in a pandemic environment. So what kinds of steps can we take to minimize gender bias and discrimination? Looking at our performance standards and taking a hard look at how people are evaluating others. You know, look at performance reviews from this department to this department with the same manager, and is that person being fair and uniform and consistent, and how he or she is evaluating performance. So as I mentioned, people need to be aware of that. The other things is this to take into account when we're talking about looking at performance. You know, we think about the fact that we're not there day to day watching how people have worked, okay? We haven't been, because we've been in a remote work environment. So we need to think about what those standards look like so that we're not holding people to what could be potentially discriminatory standards because we're making assumptions about what they are or are not doing, rather than sitting down and having conversations, candid conversations, and understanding what their workload has been like, what they've done. So for example, you know, if you had a standard, maybe one of the things you might look at for a metric is how have people come together and worked in a remote environment? Have people been there supporting their teams to get projects done and things of that nature? Those are nice objective criteria. Strengthen communication. If there's one thing that is so important now, actually through the whole pandemic, but going forward, is open communication with both your managers and employees and telling them what's going to happen. You know, a lot of employers are going to be in situations where they're bringing employees back to work. Maybe they've been on furloughs and they can bring people back. Maybe they've had layoffs now and they can bring people back. What are best practices? Look at who you're bringing back and be mindful of the practices that you're doing. You know, have we brought people back, but we haven't looked at the fact that we have excluded individuals age 60 and above because we think that, well, you know, they're high risk and we want to bring these people back last or whatever. Have we looked at, and are we looking at, who are we bringing back? Is this person that had childcare responsibilities that we saw with kids running around the videos? Well, maybe we don't want to bring them back. I mean, all of those things are things that companies should be mindful of and should be looking for. And I think the last thing is this. We have to have empathy during these time periods. You know, it requires a flexibility that we have to maintain. I mean, just because we have vaccines available now and they're going to be on the horizon doesn't mean that we're ready to go back to normal yet. So employers are still going to have to be creative and flexible and open to communication as to how they work through these issues. So that's what I have, and you know, we can ask questions at this point, but these are just things I wanted to talk to you about today, about what it's like and the impact of COVID-19 on women. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Ms. Grider. Our webinar audience was very fortunate to have heard that groundbreaking talk that you just gave. We all wish you the best of luck in the important things to come at the EEOC in the months and years ahead. So thank you.
Tommy, if I may, and this is probably not in the script or anything, but this was one of the most impressive presentations that I've heard, and my mind is already racing in regards to how we are going to be able to get this out to even more folks. And so, I mean, Katrina, thank you so much for sharing your time with us in this presentation. We're going to get this out to even more audiences and markets as we go forward. Being our authentic self is something that I'm taking to heart, and we've taken away a lot of good information that we can apply in the workplace. So Tommy, thank you for letting me interfere in this particular time, but I wanted to make sure that Ms. Grider knew our firm appreciation for you sharing your time with us this afternoon for this very important Lunchtime Live event. So thank you so much for that time. And Tommy, thank you for letting me interrupt real quick. I'll give it back to Tommy now.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I appreciate that tremendously. As I've said to you over the years, it's a privilege. It is a privilege to be able to work in partnership with you all. And thank you so much for those kind words. I tremendously appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. Now, I'm Tommy Simmons. I'm on the legal staff of Commissioner Aaron Demerson, and hopefully everybody can see my presentation here. Baker's Dozen, Top Pay, Privacy, and Unemployment Tax Laws. And I'm just going to hit a few high points in the time that we have this afternoon, and hopefully cover a lot of the most important questions regarding wage and hour and privacy related topics, and also talk a little bit about unemployment tax and what to expect for 2021. So one thing before I get into any of the tall weeds on wage and hour, I'd just like to remind employers how important it is to get new employees to fill out and sign a W-4 form. An employer has the legal right to require submission of a completed W-4 properly signed by the employee. We recommend doing it before allowing the employee to work. The W-4 has everything that an employer needs to properly report wages and pay payroll taxes to the IRS and the TWC. Allowing employees to work before they submit a W-4 invites problems if the employee quits suddenly, because then payroll wage reporting and payroll tax payments will be so much more difficult if you don't do that. So get the W-4 before allowing any employees to do any work. The most important federal law on the Fair Labor Standards Act side of things, wage and hour law, is the Fair Labor Standards Act, which has been around since 1938. The current minimum wage is still $7.25 per hour. That could go up with the new administration and the new Congress. The overtime rule is basically time and a half for all hours actually worked in excess of 40 in a 7-day work week. Child labor regulation is important for anybody employing youth workers. That would be employees who are younger than age 18. And the rules are pretty restrictive on that, especially with regard to hazardous duties. So we recommend that all employers should look at the child labor law section of the U.S. Department of Labor website, and also in our book, the Texas Guidebook for Employers, you'll find a topic devoted to the child labor issue. Equal pay. As Ms. Grider mentioned, the Equal Pay Act is getting close to its 60th anniversary. It first was enacted back in 1963, and basically it requires equal pay between men and women who are doing the same work at the same level of skill, experience, qualification, and responsibility. And if men and women doing the same job with the same qualifications are not getting the same pay, that's a potential gender discrimination issue, which is why her agency, the EEOC, would be looking at that, as opposed to the Department of Labor, which enforces the rest of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Regarding minimum salary for salaried exempt employees, that is currently $684 per week. And it's very important to avoid misclassification of people as overtime exempt. Be very careful with that. Only the senior managers and licensed professionals in a company can be salaried exempt employees. If anybody has any questions on that, please let us know via the email address for Commissioner Demerson's office, employerinfo@twc.state.tx.us. The most important state wage and hour law is the Texas Payday Law, which is Chapter 61 of the Texas Labor Code. And that law enforces the wage agreement that is in effect when the work was performed. Illegal wage deductions are restricted. A deduction from pay is legal only if it was ordered by a court or was required or specifically authorized by a law, or if it was made for a lawful purpose and authorized in writing by the employee. The Texas Payday Law also requires wages to be paid on time. So make sure that you pay non-exempt employees at least twice each month and exempt employees at least once each month. Final pay for fired or laid off employees should be done within 6 calendar days. If the employees quit, pay them their final pay by the next regular payday. And if you get a wage claim notice, respond with evidence of paychecks, hours of work, and compliance with the wage agreements. It's very important to understand what is legal to deduct from an employee's pay regarding minimum wage. On the screen are the allowable deductions below minimum wage. If you have a deduction from pay that takes somebody below minimum wage that is for a reason not on this screen, that would be a good reason to contact our office and ask, whether there might be an issue that you need to be paying attention to. We'll be very glad to, respond with any information we can about specific types of wage deductions. Do keep the Texas Payday Law in mind, though. If a deduction is not ordered by a court or required by law, it needs to be authorized by the employee in writing. So even if it's allowed under the federal law, you still need to have written authorization unless it's ordered by a court or required by a law. Regarding hours of work, basically, if somebody is at your company's disposal in such a way that they cannot use the time effectively for their own purposes, that's going to be hours worked that should count toward overtime pay. And so it's any of these categories that you see here, any job-related activity, anything that is for the benefit of the company or the job or the coworkers or your company's customers. If it involves anything that is primarily for the benefit and convenience of the company, it should be treated as hours worked. If you have any questions on that, be sure to let us know. Call our toll-free number, 800-832-9394, or send us an email. Pay agreements are enforceable even if they're not in writing, but they should be in writing. We recommend that all employers have all of their employees sign clear written wage agreements that set out as specifically as possible what all the components of the pay agreement are and what must be done to earn the pay and what may happen if certain things do not happen. Everything that is important to calculating the pay should be in the wage agreement. So pay according to the wage agreement that was in effect when the work was actually performed. That's an extremely important basic rule of wage and hour law. Now, regarding privacy in the workplace, the general issues that I'd like to highlight, number one would be a good starting point regarding any kind of communication of information about employees. All information relating to an employee's personal characteristics or family matters is private and confidential, especially medical information, but also things like social security number and date of birth and their home address and whether they have children and things like that. That's private and confidential and should be released only on a need-to-know basis within the company, and it should be released externally only if it's allowed by law or compelled by law, like with a court order. Information relating to an employee should be given very confidential treatment by the company. So if somebody has a job-related need to know it, then they can get the information. A good general guideline would be all information requests concerning employees should go through a central information release person or office. And that might be HR, it might be payroll, it might be the office manager, it might be a separate department for that purpose, but whoever is releasing information should be trained in employee confidentiality issues. Concerning privacy-related policies, provide for searches of premises and any objects that employees bring onto or out of company buildings or vehicles. Cell phones, responsible usage can be allowed, but inspection if need arises due to misuse. If somebody is misusing their personal cell phone, let's say by taking inappropriate pictures of employees without their permission or without a job-related need to do so, you should provide for that in your company policy. Computer, email, and internet usage. There should be no expectation of privacy when an employee uses your company computer systems or the email system or accesses the internet using your internet access and software. All of that is the business of the company because they're doing it with your systems and your internet access. So let employees know that in a policy. GPS tracking is certainly permissible. Let employees know, though, if that's going on. Telephone monitoring is permissible if it's your phone system. Video surveillance at the workplace, that is permissible. But it's a good idea to let employees know that that's going on, and for the public, post signs alerting the public that certain parts of the premises are subject to video surveillance. If background checks are done, make sure that you, as a company, are complying with the federal law, which is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. More information on background checks is in our book, the Texas Guidebook for Employers. Now, finally, getting to the state unemployment tax. This is the only payroll tax in Texas, the unemployment insurance tax levied by the Texas Workforce Commission. It is paid by employers, not by employees. There should be no deduction from employees' wages for the state unemployment tax. The state unemployment tax is based on your unemployment claim experience. Now, new employers will pay at 2.70% for the first 6 calendar quarters that they're in business. After that, they're eligible for a calculated experience rating. If there have been no chargebacks during the past 3 years, the employer will get the minimum tax rate, which is basically the replenishment tax. If there have been chargebacks during the past 3 years, there'll be a calculated tax rate that takes the benefit ratio into account, the 3-year chargeback total divided by the 3-year taxable wage total. And more information is on our website regarding the tax rate calculation formula. If there is a shortfall in the unemployment insurance trust fund, half of it is recovered through the replenishment tax. The other half is recovered through the replenishment ratio. But details about this are found on our website at the web address that you see on the screen. New tax rates for 2021 will be published by February of next year. February 2021, that's when employers can expect to see their tax rate notices that will be very important to begin applying when wages need to be reported and unemployment tax paid starting in April of 2021. All right, thank you very much for your attention during this part of my presentation. And now I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker, Valissa Chapa, who will be speaking about employee leave and policy issues. Let's welcome Ms. Chapa.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Tommy, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. As Tommy stated, my name is Valisa Chapa, and I am one of the attorneys in the Employer Commissioner's Office at the Texas Workforce Commission. So as part of our final Lunchtime Live for the year, we decided on a baker's dozen of important points that you need to know as an employer. So Tommy covered numbers 1 through 3. I'm going to cover numbers 4 through 6. So let's get started. These are the 3 topics we're going to be covering today: the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, medical leave related laws, and disciplinary action. So I spoke on all of these issues in prior webinars. However, sorry, I think we're having a bit of a problem with the screen share, so let me try it again. So we're going to talk about the baker's dozen. You should be seeing those 3 topics on your screen right now. I've talked about these 3 before, so I have much lengthier explanations in prior sessions, but I am going to cover the high points of these 3 as a reminder so that folks kind of know how this is all supposed to operate. So let's start with the 4th issue for Baker's Dozen, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So as many of you probably already know, this law was passed with the CARES Act back in March. It is a federal law that requires employers to give employees paid job-protected leave for COVID-related absences. First federal law in United States history that requires paid leave to employees. So really interesting. Here are the basics. It expires currently December 31st. We don't know whether or not this will be extended. Stay tuned for action in Congress to see if there's going to be extensions on there. But for now, as of today, December 17th at about 12:30, it is this law will stay in effect only until the end of the year. Also, a lot of folks want to know if we pay them under the FFCRA and then another condition is triggered, do we have to pay again? No, it's a one-time use only. Once you have paid under the FFCRA the required time, it does not reset. Also, big point, this is in addition to any other right or benefit, meaning that if someone has paid time off in their bank and they qualify for FFCRA pay, you pay them under the FFCRA first. You don't touch their paid time off. And then if they exhaust their leave under this law, then you can look to their paid time off if they have any. And of course, if they don't have any paid time off, then the other option could be to file for unemployment benefits. Now, this law is enforced by the Department of Labor. So if you have questions about it, definitely go to the DOL website for more information. Now here's the breakdown under the FFCRA. Remember, think of the FFCRA as the umbrella law. Underneath the umbrella, you have 2 people, the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, EPSLA, or the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act. So those are 2 laws within the FFCRA umbrella. So I'm going to break them down quickly for everyone here. So EPSLA, the first law under that umbrella. This is the law where you as an employer may have to pay up to 80 hours of leave if one of these 6 conditions are met. And again, there's Department of Labor guidance on this, but you can see the 6 reasons here. Here's the key. You have to pay them up to 80 hours of leave. So you kind of take it day by day and depends on how much time they need based on which condition is triggered. So if it's one of the first 3 conditions here, you pay at 100% of their regular rate of pay with a maximum of $200 per day. If it's numbers 4, 5, or 6, you don't pay them at 100% of their regular rate. You pay them at 2/3. So that's the big difference here. The top 3 pay at 100%, 4, 5, and 6 pay at 2/3. And these all require up to 80 hours of paid leave. Now, the other law under the FFCRA umbrella is the EFM-LEA. The only reason for this one is about childcare. So if we go back to this slide, you can see there's a bunch of reasons someone might need leave. Maybe they have symptoms and they're seeking a diagnosis. Maybe a doctor told them to self-quarantine. Maybe there's a shutdown order. That is different from childcare. So childcare is actually included in here, also under the EFM-LEA. So how it would work is, if it's a childcare issue first, you pay them under EPSLA, because you can see that's under condition number 5. But then once they run out of those 80 hours, if they still cannot go to work because of childcare issues, then this law gets triggered, the EFM-LEA. And that again is also paid at 2/3, but this allows for an additional 10 weeks of paid leave. Again, this law expires currently at the end of the year of 2020. So the big piece here is also tax credits. So if you have to pay for it, don't forget you can get a tax credit for the FFCRA pay. But remember, the IRS is not just going to take your word for it. You need documentation to get your tax credit. And depending on which of the conditions is triggered, I'm going to go back here to these 6 reasons, you're going to need different documentation. Obviously, if number 1 is the issue, then you're going to need the quarantine or isolation order printed out in the file. That would be different from a childcare issue. If the school is closed, you'd need something from the school confirming that the school is closed. So there's different requirements you need to get your tax credit, but here's the link at the bottom from the IRS so you can get more information on what you need. Quick point about the tax credit as well. A lot of employers have asked whether or not they can pay employees at 100% for conditions 4, 5, and 6. Under the law, you're required to pay 2/3 their pay, but a lot of employers say, well, I want to pay them 100%. Can I do that? Sure, you can, but you're only going to get the tax credit for the amount the law required you to pay. So if it requires 2/3 pay and you pay 100%, totally fine, but don't expect more than a 2/3 credit from the IRS. Now, the next baker's dozen piece is going to be on medical leave related laws. And there's a whole bunch out there in addition to the FFCRA that we just discussed. These laws have been in place for much longer, and there's a lot more development of these laws because they've been around for several years. So here's the basic list for those of you who are curious. You got the ADA, FMLA, pregnancy discrimination, and workers' compensation. I'm not going to touch much on pregnancy discrimination today because I only have a little bit of time, but I will say that that is something that employers need to be wary of. There's a lot of concern right now with COVID-19, with pregnant employees, and employers thinking, can we go ahead and let that employee go? Because we are worried that they might catch something, it might be harmful to the fetus, we're worried about COVID-19. Understandable, but it's going to look like an adverse employment action against someone who's pregnant. So it could look like you're actually punishing them, needlessly for their pregnancy, which is what could lead to legal issues. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the PDA. I really wanted to touch on this first piece. Sometimes multiple laws apply, and you want to be very careful because there's different requirements for each of these laws. So just remember this simple rule that if there are multiple coverage situations, the outcome that's most favorable to the employee is the way to go. If you're ever in that question, well, this one requires this, that requires that, usually you never get in trouble for treating the employee more favorably under the law when you're dealing with which law to follow in the interaction. On the next slide, we're going to look a little bit into the ADA. This is the big law that I think a lot of employers are forgetting about currently during COVID-19. So please remember the Americans with Disabilities Act, if you have 15 or more employees, this law applies to your business, and it prohibits employers from discriminating against people with disabilities. So this is a really important law that I think folks can often forget about just because there's so much going on. So the quick recap for the ADA. This law applies during any part of the application process, the interview process, hiring, firing, you name it, it's always there. Here's the key. If someone has a disability, the employer is required to reasonably accommodate requests for accommodation by the employee. A big issue is that employers misunderstand and think that if they have a disability and it was the result of maybe they did something at their house. I had an employer tell me that an employee drank a lot of beer on his roof and fell off and broke his arms, and he needed some accommodations to continue working. Individuals are protected. It doesn't matter how the disability came about. Also, it is physical or mental. Disabilities can be both. A lot of folks we're dealing right now with anxiety or PTSD. You've been accommodating them, the pandemic hit, they're getting even more nervous now to continue working. Their anxiety or PTSD has gotten worse because of the pandemic. You are required to continue accommodating them if the pandemic is making it worse, because at the end of the day, they have anxiety, they have PTSD, they need assistance. So if someone has a disability and is requesting accommodation, the employer is required to reasonably accommodate unless there's undue hardship. All these buzz phrases, right? Reasonable accommodation, undue hardship. What does this all mean? Here's the deal. You gotta reasonably accommodate when you're dealing with employees with disabilities. It is required under federal law. It doesn't matter if they're part-time or full-time or probationary or brand new. You have to accommodate, and there's lots of different ways to do it, and we all know the obvious ones. Modifications to the job applications, adjusting the work environment. Quick example, I hurt my back several years ago. I needed a standing desk. We propped up a bunch of binders. My coworkers helped me with standing and sitting for a few weeks. We work it out. Also, you might need to change their schedule. There's lots of different examples of reasonable accommodation that you can have. So teleworking is a huge one today because it is becoming more of a possibility. In the past, teleworking may not have been as feasible for employers because it required a lot of switching gears just with your technology that you're using, the server, etc., a lot of stuff. But now, because a lot of folks have started teleworking because of COVID-19, I would suspect that reasonable accommodation teleworking is going to become more popular in the coming years since a lot of the infrastructure has now been created to allow for that type of work. But when you're accommodating someone, don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, part-time work schedules might be needed. You might need to change your policies or allow the employee a pass on a policy, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So lots of different options. You have to get creative, and part of reasonable accommodation also has to do with COVID-19. So a very popular question is, if you have COVID-19, are you considered to have a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act? The answer is no. Having COVID-19 in and of itself does not constitute a disability, but we all know realistically complications can result. So it can lead to a disability or conditions that can be interpreted as such. So that's sort of the lay of the land there. Just having COVID-19 doesn't mean you have a disability, but it could, evolve into one. So just be conscious of that. Let's also talk about direct threat. There's a lot of questions with COVID-19, accommodating employees, and the concept of a direct threat. Here's the deal. The Center for Disease Control has said that COVID-19 is a direct threat. As of now, I checked yesterday, December 16th, the guidance has not changed. So as of right now, the idea is if someone has COVID-19, they pose a direct threat to the workplace for safety reasons. So what does that mean? Interactive process might become a point of this where you're discussing with them what needs to happen. Basically, if someone has COVID-19, not having them working in the office might be a very good idea. Some folks have COVID-19, very mild symptoms. They want to keep working, understandable. But as an employer, you want to put your foot down and say, no, we won't have you in here. That's not safe. Can you do that? Yes, you can. Under the current guidance, having COVID-19 is a direct threat. So the safest thing to do is to keep that individual from coming into the physical office as much as possible, if not entirely. Now let's talk about the interactive process. So again, break it down. We have an employee with a disability. They've requested an accommodation. But there's a lot of questions. What accommodations do they want versus what they need? Are there cheaper accommodations? Are there other unique ways? How do we figure this all out? You talk to the employee, and the way that you talk to them is known as the interactive process. So that's required under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so as you can see from the bullet points, it's mandatory, you have to do it, but it's also really good for everyone. It helps you figure out what the barriers are, you look at options. It's also really good to help show that you are trying to accommodate the employee. You want to show your receipts that you're doing what you need to do under the law, so this helps with that. It also helps you figure out if there's an undue hardship. Quick note here, employers want to know, I know for a fact they cannot continue working in their current condition. What do I do? Can I just go ahead and let them go? No, engage in the interactive process first. Think of it like the mean math teacher in school. You either get full credit or no credit. You got to show your work. So even if you know there's no reasonable accommodation that exists, you still go through the interactive process to prove it on paper. So when do you not have to accommodate? If they're no longer qualified, or maybe it's an undue hardship. So there's that buzz phrase again. If accommodating them is an undue hardship, it becomes unreasonable and your obligation ends. And one example of that would be an indefinite request for leave. If they kind of say, well, I don't know when I'm ever going to be back, you need some sort of timeline to know about an update. So having it could imply there's an undue hardship. And we look at everything when we're figuring out if it's undue hardship. We look at the job the employee does, the size of the company, how easy is it to get a temporary replacement for a while. All of those things count, all the more reason to document your work. So that's what undue hardship is about. It is significant difficulty or expense. So it includes everything, but now with COVID, it is really time to get creative, because I think the bar for undue hardship is already pretty high, and I think it's just going to get higher now that there might be some more creative ways to keep people working during a pandemic. So again, does the ADA allow employers to require employees to stay home? Yes, because the Center for Disease Control states that these folks with COVID-19, they could pose a direct threat. You have the right as an employer to tell them to stay home, even if they don't want to. For more information, I really think y'all should be looking at these links. Really, really good material. I can't say enough great things about these resources. They help to get you prepared. So take a look at those if you're interested. Also, Job Accommodation Network. I cannot say enough good things about this free resource funded by the Department of Labor. They have a free sort of hotline where you can ask questions as an employer. And of course, there's a link here from the Job Accommodation Network with accommodation strategies. Tons of good resources out there for you. I really encourage you all to take a look. Now, the FMLA, that's the other big law, the Family Medical Leave Act. I'm not going to go through the whole deal, but the basics are if you have 50 or more employees, you have to give employees up to 12 weeks of paid leave. This slide I have up here for a very important reason. If you have FMLA and the employee exhausts their FMLA leave, they use their 12 weeks, they're done, it's over. Employers will often move to, okay, well, they're not ready to come back, time to discharge. Hold off on that, because even though they may no longer be covered under FMLA, the ADA is still in play, and reasonable accommodation might include continuing to protect their job. So the point is, if they run out of FMLA, it's not over. You still have to be thinking about the ADA and if you can continue to reasonably accommodate. So for more information on FMLA, this first link, the Guide to the Family Medical Leave Act, that's one of the best resources I've seen on the FMLA. It's incredible. If you don't know about it, take a look. I promise it will be helpful. Also, take a look at the Department of Labor. They have some fact sheets and you can call them for more info. Again, lots of resources out there for you. Workers' comp. Texas is the only state that does not require workers' compensation, interestingly enough. So the difference here is, workers' comp covers job-related illnesses and things, covers employees of the company. The point here is a caution. So typically your independent contractors, they are not your employees. But if you have an independent contractor on the job site and they have their own team of workers and you start controlling that team of workers, they become your borrowed servants. And now they're under workers' comp coverage under your business. So be careful about that. Also, COVID-19 could be an occupational disease under a workers' comp claim. Don't make the decision yourself. Just report it to the workers' comp carrier, let them figure it out. And if you have questions, you can call the Workers' Compensation Division of the Texas Department of Insurance for assistance. Again, you are not alone. So the final part of my baker's dozen, number 6, disciplinary action. Not a fun topic, but out of everything I've spoken about to employers with over the years, this just rings out as one of the most important pieces that I try to communicate. So I wanted to wrap it up with this. Before you warn someone, it is so important to investigate. It's very convenient to hang your hat on what your managers or supervisors are telling you or what people have maybe your subordinates have told you, but if you don't investigate yourself, you're basically relying on their word. And no offense to anyone out there, but in order to protect yourself and the company, it is important to not just take the word for it. You really have to investigate, put the pieces together and see what you're looking at to get a really complete view of what's going on. Also, you got to document everything. If you're going to warn someone, you want to be able to justify it with your paperwork, and you want to have a plan going in. I speak to employers every day, all the time, and something I suggest is before you go into the meeting, you want your bullet point list of items to talk about so that you can stay focused, because we know when those meetings start, we go off on tangents, things change, and there has to be some sort of control. And I think having that bullet point plan, to me, is a really good way of doing that. So here are my basic ideas for warnings. If you want to do a warning, you might as well do it right. Like my colleague says, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So here are my golden rules for giving warnings. Number one, always 2 first-hand witnesses present. Basically 3 people in the room or on Zoom, right? It should be you, the employee, and then someone else with authority, never a coworker. Coworkers and colleagues should not be parts of warnings because it could be seen as embarrassing, and embarrassing warnings do not stick. So again, 3 people in the room every time. Also, you want your warnings to be in writing. You want to prove they got the warning. Sometimes they won't sign it. Do they have to sign it? No, not necessarily. The point of them signing a warning is to prove that they got it. So if they refuse to sign, the other 2 witnesses present will sign it, 2 against 1. But in writing is also important because you want to be able to prove what you talked about, those bullet points, right? So written warnings are important. Also, don't delay. We are in the holidays right now. Christmas is right around the corner. We got New Year's. It's very tempting for employers to say, you know what, we're going to not warn, we're going to hold back. If you end up warning them later, it could look like a gotcha scenario. It could look like maybe there's another reason, maybe an illegal reason why you want to warn them, and it just leads to issues. So you really don't want to delay on warnings. In my opinion, as soon as you find out about it, you have a week to take care of it with a warning. Otherwise, it becomes a little stale and it's like you've condoned it. So final warning, last slide. Final means final. You don't want to give multiple final warnings. It can be really misleading, and avoid the broad language. I've seen a lot of final warnings that will say, if you violate these rules again, disciplinary action up to and including. Well, no, if it's a final warning, if they have another infraction, that's it. So there's no disciplinary action up to, it's just termination. Also determine the scope. If they are on a final warning for attendance, you want to make it, you can make it clear this is for attendance only, or you can say, this is your final warning because of attendance, but this is your final warning for all policies. One other violation of any rule, and we're going to have to let you go. And there is a sample warning on the bottom link if you're interested. So attendance warnings, here's the COVID twist. So you want to be aware of warnings for disability related attendance issues. If someone has a disability related reason for being absent or tardy or something like that, disciplining them is going to look like you're punishing them for their disability. So that is something where you would document, you know, you're not going to discipline them for that, and you want to make it clear the employee understands that as well. That's a really important piece I think employers miss. Also consider, are you disciplining them for the absence, or is it more so because they didn't notify you as required? So if you have an attendance policy, be clear. Who are they supposed to contact, within how much time, and in what manner? Like, text your direct supervisor within 15 minutes of your shift. So maybe they're absent because of a disability, but the issue isn't the absence, it's the fact that they didn't text their supervisor. Maybe 3 hours in they did it. So you investigate, why didn't you notify as required? So if you end up disciplining someone for an absence that has disability included in there, they could try to argue retaliation. That's why you want to have really good evidence that no, it's not the absence you're in trouble for. You had the opportunity to notify us. You left us waiting for 3 hours. You didn't contact us or let us know. That's what we have a problem with. And sometimes their disability prevents them from contacting the employer on time, which is why you investigate. Finally, the bullet point at the bottom, COVID-19 absences. That's a big question today. Can you count COVID-19 absences against employees? I would say proceed with caution on that. Generally speaking, if it's just an absence due to illness that's not a disability, a lot of employers will warn employees, and there's no law specifically against it in Texas. But because this is new, we don't have any court cases or history to base this off of. If someone has COVID-19 related absences, you really do want to be careful about that. And that's why investigating the absence and figuring out what really happened will help you figure out whether or not you want to move forward with that discipline. So it's really to protect you and to make sure that warnings are justified when you investigate. So document everything. If a firsthand witness saw something, they should be documenting it in their own words. The who, what, when, where, and how. That's important as well. It is crucial. If there's anything you take from my presentation, remember, you have to document and write it down. Is it a pain? Yes. Do you need to do it? Yes. It's just, it is what it is, and it really will help you sleep better at night. So that is it for my presentation today. I thank you all so much for your attention. And I am now going to hand it over to the next speaker for today, one of the attorneys on Commissioner Demerson's team. His name is Mario Hernandez, and he's going to be discussing the next 3 parts of our Baker's Dozen. Mario, over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Really appreciate that, that kind introduction. And as Melissa mentioned, I'll be taking over for the next 3 items of the Baker's Dozen here, items number 7 through 9, as you should be seeing now on y'all's screens. And before I proceed, I just want to, thank the presenters who've already spoken, who will be speaking, for all the great information. It's really, really good info, and just really privileged to be a part of this presentation here. And so again, my thanks to the presenters and those who will be presenting. And with that, let's go into items 7 through 9 of the Baker's Dozen. So just as a recap, if y'all had, and again, you'll see a blank screen here, that's on purpose. If y'all will recall, my first presentation in this Lunchtime Live series had to deal with best practices of maintaining a safe workplace. The presentations are online, so you can revisit those whenever you'd like. And I'm going to speak about general concepts, things to keep in mind in terms of big picture aspects. And one thing that we can take away from best practices in the workplace is item number 7, having a plan. It's always a good idea to have a good laid out plan whenever you're approaching something, whether it's a policy, whether it's COVID-19 protocols. And with that in mind, having a good plan involves establishing a plan specific to your workplace. As y'all may know, different industries may have different regulations, different protocols to implement at the workplace. Just as an example, healthcare related employers might have different requirements than non-healthcare related employers. So you want to make sure that you establish a plan specific to your workplace, tailored to how you run your business, because it's not always one size fits all for whatever thing you're approaching, whether it's an attendance policy, whether it's COVID-19 procedures at your workplace. You want to have something specific to what your company does and what you're in the industry of doing. The second point underneath having a plan is communicating the plan. Ms. Greider touched on communication earlier in the Lunchtime Live event, and communication is absolutely key. As some of my colleagues have mentioned before at the conferences, a policy or a plan or a procedure that an employee does not know about is virtually worthless as it relates to the execution of that plan, because policies that employees don't know about, there's really no way you can effectively tell them, hey, look, you should have known how to do this. Communication is key. So whether that's doing communication in new ways, like a Teams meeting or online, as opposed to maybe in the workplace due to social distancing concerns and so forth. Communication will be very key. So make sure you communicate your plan, whatever it is, to your workers so that everybody is on the same page. The next thing is executing the plan and enforcing the plan. You can have the most brilliantly written policy, and it can, it can be, it can have all the trappings that will avoid litigation, but it won't be worth what you're hoping it will be worth if you don't execute it and enforce it. That will be really key. So executing your policy, that would involve identifying individuals at the workplace, whether it's an HR supervisor, whether it's a departmental supervisor, or someone else who will be executing the plan or policy that you've set forth. And enforcing the plan. As Ms. Chapa said earlier, disciplinary action may not be the most enjoyable part of the employer's responsibilities at the workplace, but it is necessary if the policies and procedures are to be followed the way that the employer wants them to be at the workplace. So again, enforce the plan, execute it, and also be cognizant of when there might be exceptions. As mentioned earlier, if a particular law intervenes and say like an attendance policy, the ADA, and so on, that's something that the employer wants to be cognizant of as well. So that's item number 7, having a plan. We'll now switch into the next item of the baker's dozen, which is keeping up to date with resources. This is also very important when you're thinking about operating at the workplace. The first point underneath this topic is that guidance changes. What may be the case today might not be the case tomorrow. As we learn more about COVID-19 and other areas of the law that are changing along with it, guidance will inevitably change, and so you want to keep up to date on that. Just as a concept, these things are, ever flowing, and that's a big thing to keep in mind. The second thing is monitor resources for updates as the guidance changes. Some of the big resources that I can think of off the top of my head are resources at the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the U.S. Department of Labor, TWC, Texas Workforce Commission, and there are several others that I'm probably not thinking of at the moment, like OSHA, OshCon, those types of agency resources. You'll want to definitely research and look at those resources to keep up to date with the latest information on how to implement your policies at the workplace. And update policies, I mentioned before, kind of a little foreshadowing in that second point there. Update your policies as necessary when new information comes to light, because you'll always want to be working with the latest info provided by agency resources. And the last point here regarding the baker's dozen is going to be item number 9, independent contractor update. Now, it does seem like kind of a long time ago, but when we were doing these events live, I spoke about the independent contractor topic. So this is kind of a treat for me to be able to let the audience know about an update that's been happening in the realm of independent contractor status, the classification of workers, and that's coming from the U.S. Department of Labor. So back in September, the U.S. Department of Labor proposed a rule dealing with independent contractors, and what the rule involved was an economic reality test. And the economic reality test surrounded 2 core factors, and basically the basis of the test considers whether a worker is in business for themselves, i.e. an independent contractor, or whether they are economically dependent on the employer, the firm that hires them to do the services. And so that's a distinction that's very important in employment law, because it can result in all kinds of unintended consequences if the entity who's hired the worker to do the services has misclassified the worker. So in this new proposed rule, the DOL centers in on 2 core factors, which include, number 1, the nature and degree of the worker's control over the work. That's going to be one of the core factors there. And the second is the worker's opportunity for profit or loss based on initiative and or investment. So this is something that the new proposed rule will emphasize. And historically, the Department of Labor had a broader economic reality test that had other factors involved in it as well. Along with this new proposed rule, there is to be an identification of 3 other factors that could help guide whether the worker is a contractor or in employment, which include the amount of skill required for the work, That's a factor that's been seen in various tests in the past. The degree of permanence of the working relationship between the worker and the potential employer, that's the permanency of relationship factor, and whether the work is part of an integrated unit of production. That's the concept of integration of services. And what's interesting here is that since the proposed rule identifies two core factors, there's a thinking that those factors will be ones that are more emphasized. And there's also a thought that that this test, if finalized as proposed, will actually allow more workers to be classified as contractors. And so there's that school of thought. However, I do also want to let the audience know that with the incoming new administration, there may be an emphasis on perhaps, going in the direction of fashioning a test that is more prone to having workers be classified as employees rather. So that all goes to the point that I mentioned previously of guidance changes. With each new year, with each new administration, different laws can change depending on what goes in various levels of, rulemaking, whether it's the federal level, the state level, the local level. You'll definitely want to be kept informed on that. And as it relates to this proposed rule, I would also keep an eye on it as well, because it may be changed, it may be modified, or it might otherwise be replaced with something else, depending on what the new administration decides to do. So with that in mind, again, that's an independent contractor update for you. And I believe that is the source material link at the bottom. So take a look at that. This PowerPoint presentation will also be available online. So I encourage you to visit the source link at the bottom of this slide. You'll get more details about this independent contractor update and other information from the U.S. Department of Labor as well. So again, just to recap, it's always a good idea to have a plan regardless of whatever you're approaching at the workplace, whether it's COVID-19 protocols, your policies and procedures. Always good to have a good groundwork before going into, those practices. Keep up to date with resources. Agency resources will be very helpful. They'll be updated, so keep in mind with that. And also the independent contractor update here for you as well. And with that, that is the end of my baker's dozen. So I really appreciate y'all's kind attention in this. Again, it's been very, privileging experience to, be a part of these productions. And so with that in mind, I'm going to now turn it over to our next presenter. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Let's see here. Yes. I'm going to hand it over to the next presenter of our Lunchtime Live session, Ms. Elsa Ramos, who will be providing you really good info that you won't want to miss out on. So without further ado, Elsa, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mario. So hopefully you guys can see me in my helmet here and my slide with my name and information on it. So like Mario said, my name is Elsa and I'm the fourth member of Commissioner Demerson's legal staff. And I'm going to be bringing up the rear of our baker's dozen. So we're going to have items 10, 11, 12, and 13 of things that we think we just needed to focus on here at the year end of our Lunchtime Live. So number 10, employer financial responsibility and unemployment claims. So this is in the terms that employers understand. Am I going to be charged back for benefits, or am I going to be billed as a reimbursing employer? Who are governmental employers and some of you nonprofits are reimbursing employers. Are you going to be charged back? So financial liability for the employers depends on a period of time known as the base period. And we covered this in a past Lunchtime Live, but it's really important because really I spoke to an employer on the phone, and after I explained the base period, he said, wow, it really is all about the base period. It absolutely is. What is the base period? It's a period of 5 calendar quarters measured back. I'm sorry, 4 calendar quarters measured back from the time that somebody files a claim. So you count back 5 calendar quarters and you take the first 4. But another way of looking at this, and we're talking about quarters here based on the quarterly reports that you employers file, okay? The quarter when a claim is filed and the quarter right before don't count. The 4 quarters before that, those blue ones, those are the ones that make up the base period of the claim. And if you're an employer who reported wages during any of those 4 quarters, you've crossed over in what I call the chargeback zone. And that is because if you're an employer in those 4 quarters, you could be charged back if you're a taxed employer, or you could be sent a bill if you're a reimbursing employer for your share of benefits that are being paid out. That's why it's really important. Back to you reimbursing employers who do not budget for unemployment claims, because you're going to get a bill that could be thousands of dollars you haven't budgeted for. And you reimbursing employers, you get to elect whether to be taxed employers or reimbursing employers. It's really important, especially for you. But it's important to know if you're a base period employer, you could be financially responsible. Okay, it's all about that base period. Now, under the COVID natural disaster, what happened because of that? For taxed employers, if the job separation resulted from the COVID-19 natural disaster, you are eligible for chargeback protection. As I've been saying for months, it's not just an automatic thing. You don't just check a box. Make sure you respond to claims. Same for you reimbursing employers. Make sure you respond to claims timely with your responses and appeals if necessary, and appeal it if you have to try and get that chargeback protection. Reimbursing employers, you're not completely protected like taxed employers, but under the CARES Act, you are entitled to a 50% credit for your bill. Okay, so if you hadn't heard about that, make sure and contact our tax department if you need information on that, because you are entitled to, once you pay 100% of the bill up front, to a 50% credit. So contact our tax department for details. Number 11 of our baker's dozen. This has to do with appeals. The burden of proof and firsthand evidence for the win, okay? A lot of the cases of the millions that we had earlier this year are now coming up for appeal. And this is a chart or a graph, a pie graph, I guess that's what we'll call it, of reasons that employers lose unemployment claims. This was a survey that was done by our appeals department a few years ago, where they surveyed and kept track of the cases, and this is what they came up with. You will notice that more than 50% of the cases employers lost that were otherwise winnable were because of the lack of firsthand evidence and not being able to meet the burden. So I'm going to explain how those two work together so that you're able to then win or avoid losing claims that are otherwise winnable. You have instructions for your appeal. Remember, your appeal is your day in court. This is where you're on the phone in a telephone hearing. You get instructions to present firsthand witnesses. What are these? These are people who saw the final incident with their own eyes or heard what was being said at the final incident with their own ears. Those are firsthand witnesses. They have a firsthand account of what happened. Any other witness is considered a secondhand witness. So if I'm the HR representative showing up at the appeal hearing and I said, I know that Bob is guilty of misconduct because Susie told me, that's secondhand hearsay. If I show up to an appeal hearing with Susie's statement that she saw Bob do whatever Bob did, that's also secondhand hearsay. And that type of evidence is not given the same weight, okay? Secondhand accounts are not given the same weight. Firsthand testimony beats out secondhand every day of the week and twice on Sunday. It is really important that at the hearing, employers present your people, your witnesses. We don't need Susie's written statement. I can still be there as the HR person to represent you, but we need Susie to swear or to affirm under oath that she's telling the truth. And so she can be cross-examined, because that's the best evidence that we have. That weighs more than secondhand hearsay. Why am I talking about the weight of the evidence? Because legally we do weigh evidence. And in cases of discharges where you have initiated the job separation, employers, you bear the burden of proving the misconduct connected with the work, which will disqualify the claimant. So how do you do that? How do we see that? Think of these as the scales of justice, right? On one side is the evidence that you present, and on the other side is the evidence from the claimant. For example, if you're firing me because I'm tardy, and I was tardy yesterday after warning, I show up to the hearing and I say I was not tardy. You show up to the hearing and say I was. okay? Who's going to win? What's going to happen with the scales? The employer's burden is just to tip those scales. So remember, if you have a firsthand witness that says they saw me be late, and my own testimony, those scales are going to balance. But think about this. If you have secondhand witnesses, not Susie, who saw me be late, but the HR manager, for example, who saw me be late, or who can attest that I was late, secondhand is not going to beat firsthand. What if you have 3 statements that I was tardy, but nobody shows up to the hearing? That is secondhand evidence, and secondhand evidence is not given the same weight as firsthand. You want to make sure your people show up and that you have enough evidence to tip those scales. You don't want what's known as a he said, she said, because when the scales balance, the employer loses in a discharge case. You have to tip the scales to basically meet the burden of the misconduct. So give us any other evidence that you have. It's really important that in an appeal hearing, you provide us your best evidence if the unemployment claim matters to you. Item number 12 of our baker's dozen, remote work, avoiding common pitfalls. We talked about this, Katrina talked about it, Melissa talked about it. Remote work is something that we're all encountering at this point and being confronted with, and it's got some great advantages and it's got some disadvantages for both employers and employees. So let's talk about employers avoiding a few common pitfalls right now. Tools and equipment. Who's responsible for providing the equipment? Can an employer require an employee to provide their own computers, phones, tablets, internet service, etc.? There's no law that says you can't, okay? So you can require as the employer for your employees to have a computer or the phone or the internet access or whatever they need to do their job. And many employers think that's great, less cost to the employer. However, beware of minimum wage issues. If you have employees that are already close to minimum wage or at minimum wage, if they're required to provide equipment, that could be a minimum wage issue that takes them below minimum wage. Think about who has control over the equipment. You want to put certain apps on it. If it's my equipment, I'm in control of that equipment. You don't have access to it, it's mine. You can't force me to give it to you. You know, legally, it's my equipment. What about repairs and maintenance? If my computer goes down, I may say, sorry, can't continue to work. So there are things for the employer to consider before making the decision to make it a BYOD situation, you know, that the employee provides their own device, bring your own device. So think about that before requiring your employees to provide their own equipment. Time tracking. This is really big for employers dealing with employees who are just newly working remotely. You want to know how much time they're spent working, right? Because you're paying for it. There are many methods available. I'm sure if you Google how to keep track of time for remote workers or workers working from home, you're going to find a slew of options. So I have listed a few there, right? Phone apps, calling in. You can be looking at whatever's going on in their computer by using apps that track keystrokes, different things you could use. However, beware of something you may not think about. A lot of employers are concerned about, am I, as the employee working remotely, spending as many hours working as I'm supposed to? I think a lot of employers think remote employees may just be goofing off, watching Netflix movies. How do I know? But think of the other side of that as well, that your hourly employees, you may end up with unexpected overtime claims. I've been working 12-hour days since I've been working from home, someone could say. The employer's not paying me. They're only paying me my 40 hours, but I work 60 hours. So because of that, you want to make sure you have clear policies in place about work schedules and unauthorized overtime. You know, make a plan, consider that, and make sure your employees are aware of it. Quality control. Now that employers are also not, well, let me take it back. Employers not only concerned about the time worked, they're also very concerned about the quality of the work that's being produced when the employer is not there managing or having a supervisor to manage the work. So what do employers do? Currently, it looks like employers sort of default to 2 methods of supervising remotely. One of them is micromanaging and the other one is surveillance. Like I was saying, employers could require employees to have their webcams, on some app always on. They could be using surveillance software to track keystrokes or search histories on the internet. Not illegal. And like Tommy was talking about, the privacy, you make sure your employees know about it if it's on their equipment, But like Tommy was saying, it does bring up some privacy concerns. The employer is entitled to know what I'm doing on my computer during work hours, but after hours, no longer the case. And know that if you're either micromanaging or using surveillance software, it does erode some of that trust with your employees. So again, just some things to be aware of. And finally, security concerns. These we're talking about the security of your own information, employer, and the information of your customers, your clients, your patients, depending on the type of work that you do. Make sure that you're thinking about this. Going back to who owns the equipment. You know, if you own it, you can be responsible for putting restrictions on there, putting apps on there that help safeguard the information, because information is what we're talking about here, securing that. Also, what about, you know, using VPNs to safeguard your information? There are things that you should be using to avoid some of these things right here. Many of us working from home are not the only ones living in the household. So you may have non-employees that have access to private or confidential information. How are you going to deal with that? Are your employees allowed to travel with their computer, with the tablet, if it has information on it? How are you going to protect that, right? So these are things I can't give you an answer for us right now, but this is something for you to be aware of and make a plan for as you move forward with your employees working remotely, if they are going to be having access to or dealing with information that is sensitive or confidential. And finally, number 13, in the last few minutes I have here, of the baker's dozen. It was the eve of the party. So what is this? Many years ago, okay, a few years ago, I wrote a poem about office parties, basically, and I framed it as a cautionary tale of something for employers to consider. And I'm going to be reading to you here, a very dramatic reading of "'Twas the Eve of the Party." If you'd like to follow along with me with, you know, I have a few photos here to accompany the reading. "'Twas the eve of the party, and all through the land, all employees were stirring the drinks in their hands. The bosses declared this a booze-free event in hopes of avoiding last year's incidents. But few had paid heed to instructions this year. There were bottles and mixers and cases of beer. Did someone say Joe was removing his jeans? He was seen on his way to the copy machines. The last thing that anyone here wants to see are digital scans of his anatomy. Oh no, there goes Bob with a mistletoe sprig. Someone should stop him. He'll end up in the brig. Does he actually think that his antics are cute? A repeat of last year may bring us a lawsuit. Oh no, now Susan is stumbling. Someone please get her keys. She's really impaired. Should we call the police? An arrest in her state would be bad enough, but losing her job too, now that would be tough. She could easily lose control of her car for driving as drunk as if leaving a bar. And what if she crashes? That would be such a shame. If someone gets hurt, is the business to blame? While Susan as driver would of course be responsible, the business as party host may also be liable. Ignoring instructions this year once again may lead us to incidents causing much pain. Employers and workers, I ask, heed these words. A drama-free party is really preferred. Please know that there's a way out of all this, a fix. Alcohol and holiday parties don't mix. Thank you. I'm not done yet. That was written when we were foreseeing BC pre-COVID that people were getting together in person for the office, holiday party, the Thanksgiving, the Super Bowl party, the Christmas party, the New Year's party, and pointing out that adding alcohol to the mix, not always a great idea. And now some of you are thinking, it's like, well, this is the age of COVID. We're not going to be doing get-togethers. I know some of you are going to still be doing get-togethers in person. Perhaps you're going to social distance and wear masks, but you are going to be likely getting together for the holidays. Many others of you who, because of the remote, situation and COVID, are going to do virtual gatherings thinking that doesn't apply to us. Not necessarily safer. Think about what's going on with Teams meetings, Zoom meetings, virtual meetings. People are in their homes. You're feeling a little comfortable. Be aware of what could be broadcast. You may be showing things to your coworkers or your managers that you were not really aware of, okay? So I'm back to, if you include alcohol as the employer, do not encourage or provide or suggest that alcohol be part of your parties or get-togethers, okay? We all know that under the influence, certain things sound like a good idea when they're really not. Remember also that because of technology and because we're not part computer, we have some glitches. Sometimes you think you turn off the camera and you don't. Sometimes you think you mute and you don't. So I think it's worth repeating, employers, if you are going to be having any kind of work gathering or work meeting, it's really important that if your employees are going to be interacting, that they keep their faculties intact. So that's it on my Zoom Baker's Dozen. So bringing up the end here, I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you who have attended these and joined us since we started these. And I'm going to say happy holidays on behalf of the legal team and Commissioner Demerson. I'm going to be handing the baton over to you. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Melissa. And thank you for all the attorneys, all the presenters here today. There's a little bit of an echo, but I'm going to talk through this thing. So I'm going to go ahead. We have 5 more minutes left. We're going to be out here at 1:30 on the dot. And so I want to allow Tommy and you guys to hit any questions that we might have over the next 2 to 3 minutes or so, and then I'll close out to allow our participants to move on with their day. So I'll turn it back over to Tommy Simmons for any last minute questions or so.
Yes, sir, Commissioner. Thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. We've already had a couple of questions come in via the employer email, employerinfo@twc.state.tx.us. Here's one. What are the wage rules for salaried employees? Do you have to pay them their full weekly wage if they work at any time during the week? And what I would say on that is generally no. If an employee misses work due to personal business or illness, usually you can deduct a day's worth of salary out of the salary of an exempt employee, but specific reasons really do matter. So for a complete list of legal deductions from the salaries of exempt salaried employees, we have a topic in our book, and look for the topic salary test for exempt employees. And just a minute here, concerning leave-related laws, I'm going to let Valisa probably answer this one. And the question that came in over the email was, what is the proper wording to make sure paid time off vacation is used but not abused? And this employer is referring to one person who seems to take advantage of being off to the detriment of the rest of the office. So basically, proper wording in a policy to make sure that paid time off is used but not abused. Valisa, what would you say about that?
I would say as a starting point in your policy, the core point is to say what you mean and mean what you say. So if you think that an employee is abusing the leave policy and you want to put that some sort of language in there, you might want to start with something about how leave requests should be appropriate. People should not be taking more leave than is necessary for the respect of others in the workplace, sort of thing. And then also having in the policy the requesting the leave, not just taking it. It's one thing to say, hey, I'm leaving. It's another to request the time off and have it granted. And then, of course, management needs to be documenting the absences. And if they are excessive, it may not be having something specifically in the policy. It's more so addressing the attendance issues directly with the employee, figuring out why the absences are excessive, letting them know you've noticed that, and trying to figure out what you can do to minimize that. Sometimes a simple discussion with the employee can really go a long way.
Well, thank you very much, Valisa. And a real quick question. This looks like it's probably more in Mario's area on independent contractors. This question came in, why can't we just have the worker sign an agreement that they will not be an employee? Won't a written contract make a difference? What would you say on that, Mario?
Thank you, Tommy. Again, Mario Hernandez here. That's a really good question. And basically what I'd say to that is that while a contract is one element of the working relationship, it's not the only element, and various regulating agencies that look at the classification of workers topic have other elements that get explored as well. Things like, is the worker really their own independent business? Do they invest in their own enterprise? Do they provide their own tools and equipment? So a contract by itself may not be determinative of whether the worker is a employee or a contractor. The entire working relationship gets examined, and my guidance would be as well to visit those agency sites, the TWC, the IRS, the Department of Labor, and look at their tests to see and get a preview of what might get looked at in an examination of those relationships.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mario. Well, it looks like that's all that came in over the email address, but I'm sure that other people will ask questions as well. Commissioner, I'd like to turn it back over to you for any closing comments you'd like to make.
All right, Tommy, thanks so much. We're at 1:30 right now. And so again, Katrina Grider, thank you so much. Tommy, Elsa, Valisa, Mario, I appreciate all that you guys do. And what a way to end the year. As I close out, I wanted to congratulate those employers that received awards from the Texas Workforce Commission. We were honoring the Veteran-Friendly Company of the Year, the Small Employer Company of the Year, and the Large Employer Company of the Year. And so our veteran-friendly company was Excel Energy, that was recommended by the South Plains Workforce Solutions South Plains and the Panhandle. Congratulations to Excel Energy that are making a difference for by hiring veterans. Our Small Employer of the Year was Research Advanced Methods, better known as RAM Incorporated. And that was nominated by the Workforce Solutions of West Central Texas. And then lastly, our Large Employer of the Year was Doctors Hospital Renaissance, nominated by Workforce Solutions, the Lower Rio Grande Valley team. And so thank you to the entire team. Thank you, employers, for all that you guys do. And we're going to close out, and it's already been stated, but happy holidays and the best of a happy and prosperous 2021 as we move forward. Thank you guys for all that you do. Thank you.